The immortal vampire king takes a human bride for power, not love, and immediately regrets chaining himself to her fragile mortality. But when the great blizzard of 1888 seals the castle and unleashes hunters, famine, and a treacherous rival prince, her hidden courage becomes the kingdom's last defense. In a night of snow and blood, the king learns that the bride he despised is the only one he cannot bear to lose. People still argue about whether the vampire king ever truly loved his bride. If you stay with this story, you'll see how that answer was forged in snow, regret, and a single night that refused to end. The winter of 1888 lay over the mountains like a held breath. Far below the black cliffs, the human villages slept under thin layers of snow, their chimneys drawing pale lines of smoke into a sky the color of bruised steel. Above them all, like a shadow nailed to the stars, rose the castle of King Lucian Drakov, last of the vampire kings, ruler of a kingdom that most humans believed existed only in frightened stories told near dying fires. Inside those stone walls, candles burned low and music faded, because the wedding feast had ended. The human musicians had been dismissed, the nobles had bowed themselves away, and the great hall now smelled of extinguished wax and wilted roses. Only the echo of vows remained, tangled with the thin notes of a violin that would not fully leave Lucian's ears. He stood alone before the tall arched windows, their glass clouded by his own cold breath, watching the snow drift down in slow, patient spirals. He had seen 10,000 nights like this, and yet never one that felt so wrong. Tonight, a human bride slept under his roof. Tonight, for the first time in 4 centuries, a mortal heart had been bound to his throne. He already regretted it. You have to understand something about Lucian. Monsters are simple. They chase what they want and never look back. He was worse than a monster because he remembered how to be human. He remembered his mother's hands, the way she used to tuck his hair behind his ear when he was still a boy, long before the bite, long before the crown. He remembered the warmth of bread, the ache in his chest the night his father died. He remembered what it cost people to trust a king. So when his council begged him to take a human princess as his bride, to seal peace between their hidden realm and the starving valley kingdom, he thought only of duty. A marriage to Princess Alina would stop the human armies, protect his people from torches and iron, keep both sides alive. On parchment, it was perfect. In his heart, it felt like betrayal. What right did an immortal creature have to claim a life measured in fragile years? Footsteps whispered behind him. Lucian did not turn. He had heard those steps all evening, careful, not yet used to the echo of stone. The new queen moved like someone trying not to wake a sleeping dragon. "Alina," he said, his voice smooth but distant, "you should be resting." "I tried," she answered softly. "The bed is too large. It feels like a stage, and I am waiting for an audience to decide if they approve." He turned then. She stood a few paces away, still wearing the white gown from the ceremony, its lace sleeves brushing her wrists, diamonds catching the candlelight like tiny captive stars. Her dark hair tumbled over one bare shoulder, the silver crown slightly crooked from hours of polite bows she did not yet know how to give. There was color in her cheeks from the climb to the tower, but her hands twisted nervously in the folds of her skirt. She was not the frightened child he had expected. Her eyes, clear, steady, brown like warm earth, met his without flinching. He despised himself a little for noticing how alive she looked. "The castle is cold," she added, hugging her arms around herself. "I thought perhaps the King of Night would not feel it, but I do." Lucian lifted a hand, and the fire in the hearth obeyed with a low roar, leaping higher in the stone mouth of the chimney. Heat washed through the room. For a moment, her face lit with simple human relief, and that small, unguarded look pierced him more sharply than any hunter's stake. "I have ordered human food prepared for you," he said, keeping his tone formal. "Bread, broth, Fruits that can still be found in winter. You will not be asked to share my diet." The faintest smile tugged at her mouth. "That is kind of you, Your Majesty." Kind, the word tasted strange. He had slaughtered armies. He had seen villages flee at the mere rumor of his name. Yet this girl, traded away by desperate parents, thanked him because he had remembered she needed soup. "You do not have to thank me," he said too quickly. "It is practical. If you fall ill, the treaty fails. This marriage is a shield, nothing more." Her smile faded a little. "I know what I am, King Lucian, a signature in flesh. I did not expect poetry." She looked down at her hands, then forced herself to meet his gaze again. "But my people will not starve this spring. That is enough for me." Lucian studied her. There was no accusation in her voice, only a tired kind of courage that made his centuries feel heavier on his shoulders. She should have been angry. She should have hated him. Instead, she spoke of villagers he had never seen, of children whose names he would never know. "You do not fear me?" he asked quietly. "I do," she admitted, "but I fear winter more, and men in uniforms who say that burned houses are a necessary sacrifice." A shadow crossed her face. "At least you keep your word. They say no one who has offered you loyalty has ever been betrayed." He turned away before she could see his surprise. That was not the story humans usually told about him. They whispered of his thirst, his wrath, the way he could silence a battlefield with a single command. Yet this young woman, his unwilling bride, had come to him on the strength of a rumor about his honor. "This," he thought bitterly, "is why I regret you, because you believe I am better than I am." A gust of wind slapped the windows, rattling the glass in its lead seams. The castle shuddered. For just a heartbeat, something like the taste of iron brushed Lucian's tongue, sharp and metallic, as if the night itself were holding back a scream. "Elena," he said, his eyes narrowing, "stay away from the windows." Before she could ask why, the answer arrived. The first crossbow bolt struck the pane with a cracking sound, a spiderweb of white lines exploding across the glass. A second bolt followed, slipping through the fractured corner in a hiss of cold air and wood, spinning toward her shoulder. Lucian moved. To human eyes, it would have looked like a blur, a shadow breaking free from the stone. To him, it was a familiar dance. His hand closed around the shaft of the bolt an instant before it reached her, the wood burning against his palm from the force of its flight. He twisted, using his own body as a barrier, and the bolt clattered to the floor at their feet. Elena gasped, stumbling back against the wall as shards of glass rained around them like frozen rain. Outside, shouts rose from the darkness, human voices, angry, afraid, carried on the wind. "Hunters," Lucian murmured. His guards were already moving along the battlements, cloaks streaming. Somewhere a bell sounded, a low, warning note that vibrated in his bones. For centuries, he had heard that bell before battle. It always meant the same thing. Someone out there would rather see this marriage end in blood than in peace. "Stay here," he told Elena, his voice colder than the wind. "Do not open the door for anyone but me." Her hand shot out, catching his sleeve. "Wait, you're going out there, alone." He glanced at the broken window, the black shapes flickering below. "It will not take long." "You could be hurt," she blurted, then flushed at how foolish that sounded. "I mean, what if they have swords of silver, or—" He almost smiled. "I am not so easy to kill, Princess." "But they are," she insisted, her grip tightening. "Your guards, the hunters, they're all someone's son, someone's father. Please do not let this become a slaughter on either side. This night has taken enough from both of us." Her words cut through the rising roar of his instincts, that old, cold hunger for swift revenge. In another age, he would have answered bolts with fire, fear with fear. Tonight, his new bride begged him for restraint, though the attack had been meant for her. He could have shaken her off. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, just for a moment, and felt the fragile thrum of her pulse under his fingers. "I will do what I can," he said, and vanished into the storm of his own making. The courtyard below the tower was a blur of motion when he landed, boots skidding across snow, torches flaring, horses rearing. A knot of hunters had pushed through the outer gate before it closed, faces wrapped in scarves against the cold, cheap iron blades shining dully. They were young, most of them, desperate. He could smell fear on them more strongly than sweat. "Stand down," Lucian called, his voice carrying with inhuman clarity. "You are trespassing on sovereign ground. Lay down your weapons and you will leave alive." One of the hunters stepped forward, a man with frost in his beard and eyes like carved stone. "We will not let you keep the king's daughter as your captive, monster," he shouted. "Release her, or we burn this den of curses to the ground." Lucian's lips thinned. So this was the story traveling through the valleys, that the princess had been stolen, not sent. That he was a kidnapper, not a reluctant ally. He almost laughed at the cruel simplicity of it. "I have harmed no one here tonight," he said. "Your princess stands under my protection by her own choice and that of her family. Turn back now." Something small shifted behind the hunter's anger. Weariness. Hunger. The lines around his eyes told a different story, one of fields ruined by frost, of children coughing in smoky huts, of a king in the valley promising coin for the head of a vampire. Lucian saw it all in an instant, as clearly as if it had been painted on the man's face. He felt his own anger falter. Before the hunter could answer, one of the younger men panicked, let out a shout, and charged forward with his sword raised. It would have been so easy to end it there, to snap bone and scatter fear. Instead, Lucian moved just enough to disarm him, twisting the sword from his hand and sending it skidding across the snow. The youth fell face first into the drift, more shocked than hurt. "No blood tonight," Lucian said quietly, more to himself than to them. "Not if I can help it." He signaled, and his own guards closed in, forming a ring around the intruders, not striking, simply containing. For a moment, the courtyard was a frozen painting. Steel that did not swing, fangs that did not bite, men breathing hard in clouds that rose and vanished into the winter air. Lucian looked back at the leader. "Take your men and go home. Tell your families the princess lives, and that no war will come from this castle if I can prevent it. Bring your anger to your king, not to my gates." The hunter hesitated, clearly wrestling with pride and fear and responsibility. At last he spat into the snow, a small, bitter gesture of defiance, and jerked his head at his companions. "Fall back," he muttered. "We're not dying for a rumor." They retreated, stumbling through the open gate, vanishing into the darkness from which they had come. The bell stopped ringing. The torches dimmed. On the balcony above, Lucian could feel Alina's eyes watching, though he did not look up. "Spare the boy," he told his captain, nodding toward the young hunter still on his knees in the snow. "Give him food and send him after the others at dawn. No harm." The captain blinked, surprised. "Majesty, he tried to kill the queen." Lucian's gaze hardened. "He tried to protect her, according to the story he was told. That is not a crime I can condemn." As he walked back through the stone corridors, the castle seemed to breathe around him, releasing tension in slow, invisible sighs. Servants peeked from doorways with wide eyes. Some bowed, others simply stared, unsure whether to fear him more or less. At the tower door, he paused, hand on the carved iron handle. For the first time since the vows, he felt something like exhaustion tug at the edges of his mind. Inside, Alina was waiting by the broken window, her arms still wrapped around herself. Snowflakes drifted through the cracked glass, melting when they touched her hair. When she saw him, her shoulders sagged in relief. "You're not hurt," she said and laughed once shakily. "Of course you're not. How foolish of me." "No one is dead," he answered. For tonight, that is enough." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't quite let fall. "Thank you. I know it would have been easier to end them." He looked at her, really looked, and saw that she understood what that mercy had cost him in reputation, in fear, in the iron language of power. She was not as naive as he had wanted to believe. "You asked me not to make this night a slaughter," he said quietly. "I honored your wish. Do not make me regret it." She stepped closer, ignoring the cold wind slipping through the broken glass. "I won't," she whispered. "If we are truly to share this life, then let the first thing we share be the choice not to kill when we don't have to." Something inside him shifted, an old door creaking on long-rusted hinges. For centuries, he had ruled alone, every decision his and his alone. Now, in the space of a few hours, this mortal girl had stood beside him in a way none of his immortal court ever had. He should have pushed her away. Instead, he found himself searching her face, wondering how many winters those eyes would see before closing forever, and why that thought troubled him more than any hunter's weapon. Far beyond the shattered window, the night deepened. Clouds gathered over the distant valley, heavy and low, swallowing the stars one by one. The wind changed direction, carrying with it a strange stillness, as if the world were gathering its strength. Alina shivered and glanced toward the horizon. "It feels different," she murmured, "as if something is waiting." Lucian followed her gaze, his senses prickling. Over the far mountains, the first wide curtain of white began to fall, thicker, heavier than ordinary snow, swallowing rooftops and fields in an instant. It moved like a living thing, rolling toward them with slow, implacable purpose. "There is a storm coming," he said, more to himself than to her, "and it is not like any I have seen." He did not yet know that people in faraway cities would one day call it the blizzard of 1888, or that it would trap millions and rewrite the maps of both the human world and his own. He only knew that, for the first time in a very long life, he felt something like fear not for himself, but for the small, fragile figure standing beside him. Alina reached for his hand without thinking, her fingers slipping into his cold ones as the first real gust of the storm howled against the castle walls. "Whatever it is," she whispered, "we will face it, won't we, together?" The castle lights flickered. The snow outside thickened into a white wall, swallowing the last trace of the valley. Somewhere deep within the stone, an old, forgotten door slammed shut all by itself. Lucian looked down at their joined hands, then out at the approaching storm, and realized that the bride he regretted might be the only thing standing between his kingdom and ruin. He tightened his grip on her fingers, not yet ready to answer, as the world outside disappeared into swirling white. People who lived through that winter say the storm did not arrive all at once. It crept into their bones first, and only later into their streets. In the castle, the first sign was not the snow, but the silence, the way even the bravest voices grew softer as the wind began to scream. By morning, the valley was gone. Lucian stood with Alina at the tallest window, the glass repaired in the night by careful hands. Where there had once been villages and winding roads, there was now only a white emptiness that stretched to the horizon. The world looked erased. Snow hammered the stone like a living thing. It moved sideways, in choking waves, blurring the castle towers and swallowing the sound of bells. The sun was a dull silver coin behind the clouds, too weak to cast a shadow. Even Lucian, who had watched centuries turn like pages, felt something new tighten in his chest. "This is not ordinary," he murmured. Alina's breath fogged the glass. "Can your people still travel in that?" "Perhaps for a short distance," he said, "but not safely. Horses will break their legs. Men will lose their way and lie down to sleep in the snow." His eyes narrowed. "We are alone for now." Behind them, the council argued in harsh whispers. Elder vampires in dark coats and polished boots paced like caged wolves, their pale faces drawn with worry and hunger. They saw the storm as a sign, an omen, and though none said it aloud, a convenient excuse. "Your Majesty," said Lord Vladik, a thin figure with eyes like chipped ice, "the marriage has angered the old powers. This blizzard comes the very night you bound yourself to a mortal. You must send her away. Let her return to the valley when the storm clears. It may yet appease the fates." Elena turned, stiffening. Lucian did not move. "And how," he asked calmly, "do you propose we send her away? On whose carriage? Through which roads?" Vladik faltered, then lifted his chin. "When the snow lightens, we will find a way. Until then, keep her guarded. The humans may blame us for this storm. If they march, we cannot protect the queen and the realm at once." "The humans cannot march," Elena said quietly. "Not in this. They will be fighting just to keep their fires lit." Lucian's gaze flicked to her, measuring. "She is right," he said. "No one is marching anywhere. For now, the war is the weather." He dismissed the council with a flick of his hand. They left in a whisper of cloaks and resentment, some bowing more stiffly than others. When the door closed, the room felt larger and colder. Elena wrapped her fingers around the windowsill. "Do they all hate me?" "They fear change," Lucian answered. "They have lost much and fear losing more. Hatred is easier to hold than fear." "And you," she asked, softer, "do you also fear what I might take from you?" He intended to answer with a sharp, clever remark, but the question cut too close. He walked away instead, gesturing for her to follow. "Come," he said. "If we are to be trapped together, you should know the place you are trapped in." The tour began like a practical thing. Stone corridors, old kitchens, narrow staircases that twisted like secrets. Yet as they moved, the castle slowly changed from a prison into a story. In the great library, dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts, disturbed by their steps. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling, filled with books in languages Elena had never seen. She traced the spine of one gilded volume with awe. "You read all of these?" she asked. "Not all," Lucian admitted, "but enough to know that most wars begin with someone deciding that another creature's suffering does not matter." She looked up at him, surprised by the quiet conviction in his voice. "Then, why did you fight so many?" "Because sometimes," he said, "war arrives whether you invite it or not. The only choice left is who you stand in front of when it comes." They moved on. In the portrait hall, firelight flickered over paintings of kings and queens with Lucian's sharp cheekbones and strange, watchful eyes. In one corner hung a smaller, softer canvas. A human boy on a brown horse, hair tangled by wind, laughter caught halfway across his face. Elena paused. "Is that you?" Lucian's mouth tightened. "It was, before I learned what forever feels like." "You look happy," she said. "I hadn't yet discovered how many people a crown can disappoint." He seemed about to say more when a sound sliced through the hush of the corridor. A faint, desperate note that did not belong inside stone walls. A horn, low and broken. Lucian stilled. The second blast came weaker, almost lost under the roar of the storm. "That's outside," Elena breathed. "Someone's out there." "It could be a trick," he said. "Hunters, or enemies from the old clans testing our gates. Or it could be people who are freezing to death," she shot back. "You just said most wars start when someone decides another creature's suffering doesn't matter." Her words hit him with uncomfortable accuracy. For a long beat, his expression did not change, but Elena saw the struggle in the small tension along his jaw. At last, he turned sharply toward the stair. "You will remain here," he ordered. "I will send my guard captain to keep you safe. I won't risk you in that storm." "You can't go alone," she protested. "You need someone who knows how frostbite looks, how long a human can stay in the cold before." "Elena," His voice was gentle, but iron lay underneath. "I have walked through winters that turned armies into statues. I will not fall to this one. Trust me enough to let me keep you warm and alive." His eyes softened. "Please." The last word, unexpected and almost human, caught her off guard. She swallowed the argument on her tongue, knowing somehow that if she pushed now, she would not be testing his strength but his fear. "Come back," she said instead. "Not as a king, just come back." He inclined his head once, the gesture solemn as a vow, and then he was gone down the stairs, through a side door, into the white howl of the courtyard. Outside, the world had narrowed to a few yards of swirling snow. Lucian's cloak whipped behind him, red against the blinding white, as he and two of his fastest knights fought their way through the drifts. The horn sounded again, weaker still, somewhere beyond the outer wall. The gates groaned open against the weight of the storm. Beyond them, the path vanished, swallowed by drifts taller than a man. The air scoured exposed skin like shards of glass. Breath turned to ice on eyelashes, on beards, on the fur of the horses that refused to step forward. Lucian did not need the road. He trusted older senses, the faint heat of life flickering at the very edge of perception, the way sound bent around the shape of dying bodies. He moved toward that invisible pull, one step after another, each footfall sinking deep. They found the overturned sleigh first, half buried, its wooden runners snapped. A horse lay to one side, wide eyes frozen open, snow caked in its mane. Nearby, a man huddled over another, cloak spread wide like broken wings, trying to shield the smaller body from the wind. The man's beard was frosted white. Lucian recognized him even before he lifted his face. The hunter leader from the night before. "You again," the man rasped, voice shredded by cold. "Come to finish what you spared." Lucian dropped to one knee beside him, ignoring the insult. The younger figure beneath the cloak stirred. A boy, little more than 16, lashes clogged with ice. "Be still," Lucian said. "You were lucky the wind blew your horn this way." The hunter let out a broken laugh. "Feels like luck." Lucian signaled his knights. "Take the boy," he ordered. "Wrap his hands, keep his feet moving. If he sleeps, shake him." As they obeyed, Lucian turned back to the older man. "Can you walk?" The hunter tried, managed a few steps, then nearly collapsed. Lucian caught him easily. "Lean on me," he said. The man hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion, then surrendered his weight with a bitter curse. As they turned back toward the castle, one of the knights called out, "Majesty, there is another." Half buried in a drift on the far side of the broken sleigh lay a third figure, motionless, cloaked from head to toe in heavy fabric weighted with ice. Only a gloved hand showed, fingers stiff and curled. Lucian's pupils narrowed. Beneath the layers of snow and wool, he sensed something different, a thread of life that burned hotter, sharper, touched with a strange, familiar dignity. Not a common soldier, someone used to command. He brushed the snow away from the face, and the wind chose that moment to fall still, as if holding its breath. Smooth features, lips blue with cold, dark hair plastered to a pale brow. The seal on the cloak's clasp flashed in the weak light. A royal crest, but not his. For the first time that morning, Lucian truly swore. "What is a valley royal doing on my mountain in this storm?" The hunter's eyes slitted open. "Came for the princess," he whispered, "to bring her home." Lucian looked back down at the unconscious man in his arms, at the familiar emblem, one he had seen pressed into wax on treaty letters delivered in trembling hands. This was no ordinary noble. This was Adrian, heir to the human throne, Alina's closest friend since childhood, once almost her promised husband. And he was dying on Lucian's mountainside. "Take the boy and the hunter," Lucian snapped to his knights. "Run, if any of them fall, you do not stop. I'll bring this one." He gathered Adrian as if he weighed nothing, pressing the frozen body against his own cold chest, and turned into the storm. The castle lights a faint, flickering promise in the distance. By the time they reached the gates, the snowfall had thickened to a white curtain. The guards heaved the doors open just long enough for them to stumble through, then slammed them shut again to keep the drifts from pouring in. Snow clung to Lucian's hair, his lashes, his cloak, giving him the look of a statue carved from frost and shadow. Servants rushed forward, exclaiming, forming a panicked circle around the unconscious humans. Torches sputtered, dropping sparks on the stone. Somewhere above, footsteps pounded down the tower stairs. Alina burst into the hall, skirts gathered in her fists, hair tumbling free of its pins. For a heartbeat, she saw only Lucian, and then her gaze dropped to the man in his arms. Her face went very still. "Adrian," she whispered, the name a sound of disbelief and old affection tangled together. Everyone in the hall felt the way the word landed between the Vampire King and his human bride, sharp as a blade and soft as a memory. As Lucian stood there with his rival's life pressed against his heart and the storm howling at his back. Every story has a moment when the past walks into the room and sits down at the same table as the future. In that frozen hall, with snow melting into puddles around their feet, Alina's past lay in Lucian's arms, and no one knew which man her heart would choose to keep alive. "Bring him to the warm room," Alina ordered, voice suddenly steady. "Now." No one argued. Rank and crown blurred when a human life hung by a thread. Lucian carried Adrian down a side passage, past tapestries that blurred in Alina's vision. She ran beside them, one hand hovering a breath away from Adrian's face, afraid to touch and find no warmth at all. The warm room was an old solar with thick walls and a fireplace big enough to stand in. Lucian's servants had kept it blazing since the first hints of storm, a pocket of stubborn summer in the middle of winter stone. They laid Adrian on a low couch near the fire. Steam began to rise from his cloak as the ice melted. "Get those wet clothes off him," Alina said. "But be careful with his fingers. If they're frostbitten and you rub them too hard, you'll do more harm than good." A maid blinked at her, then nodded and began to work with gentle hands. Alina knelt at Adrian's side, watching his chest for the small, shallow rise and fall that meant he was still with them. Lucian stood a few steps back, tracking every movement with unreadable eyes. His knights had carried the other rescued men to a nearby room. Muffled voices and the crackle of more fires seeped through the walls. The castle, which had always felt vast, now seemed too small to hold so many beating hearts and old grudges at once. Alina glanced up at him. "Can you help him with your abilities?" Lucian considered, then knelt across from her. "My blood is not a toy," he said quietly. "It ties, it binds. Once taken, it leaves marks that do not fade. It is not a choice I should make for your prince." "He is not my prince," Alina said almost too quickly. Then softer. "He is my friend, and he is your ally whether he knows it yet or not, please." The storm roared against the shutters, as if reminding them how little time they had. Lucian hesitated only a moment longer, then drew a small dagger from his belt. Alina flinched. "Wait, I didn't mean." He shook his head. "I will not turn him, only strengthen what life remains." He pressed the blade to his own wrist. There was a flash of red, quick and neat, no more dramatic than a paper cut. A single drop of dark blood welled up, rich with something older than the castle itself. Lucian touched that drop to Adrian's lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Adrian jerked as if lightning had passed through him. His eyes flew open, unfocused, pupils blown wide. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against everyone's skin. Alina grabbed his hand. "Adrian, it's me. You're safe. You're in the mountain castle." His gaze scrambled, caught, and finally landed on her face. Relief and confusion crashed together in his expression. "Elena," he croaked, we thought." His eyes slid past her to Lucian, and the warmth vanished, replaced by sharp, instinctive hate. "You," Adrian rasped, trying to sit up. His hands shook too badly to bear his weight, but he still reached for a weapon that wasn't there. "Get away from her." "Adrian, stop." Elena put both hands on his shoulders to steady him. "He saved your life." Adrian coughed, a rough, painful sound. "He took you. He made you marry him." "No," she said firmly. "My father and council agreed to this. I chose it, Adrian, for our people. For you, for all of them freezing in the valley right now." The words seemed to hurt her more than they hurt him, but she did not look away. Adrian's face crumpled in disbelief. "You can't mean that. We were supposed to rule together. You and I, that was the plan since we were children." She swallowed, feeling the memory of simpler days like a stone behind her ribs. Two children racing through sunlit orchards, crowns made of wildflowers, making promises they did not yet understand. "We were supposed to protect our kingdom," she said. "This marriage is how I am keeping that promise. It just looks different than we imagined." Across the fire, Lucian watched her with a strange, almost painful understanding. He knew what it was to outgrow promises made with a lighter heart. Adrian followed her gaze and seemed to truly see Lucian for the first time. Not the monster from campfire stories, but a tall, pale man with snow still melting in his hair and a faint line of red on his wrist. "What did you do to me?" Adrian demanded. "I gave you enough strength to argue with me," Lucian replied dryly. "You were dying on my mountainside with your men. I brought you in. You can hate me tomorrow. For now, you will rest." "I don't take orders from you." "Then take them from me," Elena cut in. "Please, Adrian, the storm is worse than any we've seen. We're all trapped here together. For now, survival matters more than pride." Her words hung in the warm air. After a taut silence, Adrian sagged back against the cushions, breath coming in shallow pulls. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll live, but I won't trust him." Lucian inclined his head, accepting the terms. "Trust is not required, only that you do not try to stab anyone while you can barely lift a spoon." To everyone's surprise, a few of the watching servants snorted with nervous laughter. The tension in the room loosened by a hair. Elena gave a shaky smile, grateful for even that tiny crack in the wall between them all. Over the next hours, the castle shifted into a place of refuge rather than fear. The rescued hunter boy slept under thick blankets near the kitchen hearth, his hands wrapped in soft cloth. The bearded leader, whose name turned out to be Tomas, took his place at the long table with the other human guests, wariness carved deep into his face, but eyes bright with stubborn life. Lucian gave strict orders: no feeding on guests, no threats, no wandering alone near the human quarters. Some of his subjects bristled, unused to such restraint during lean times, but none dared challenge him openly. The storm had made them all humble. At Elena's urging, they opened a few of the great halls to everyone, lighting extra fires, setting out warm drinks and what food they could spare. Vampires who had once been whispered of as shadows now stood awkwardly beside shivering humans, both groups pretending not to be as curious about each other as they really were. One night, Elena found Lucian on the gallery above the main hall, leaning on the stone railing, watching his people and hers with a small, surprised frown. Below them, a maid taught a young vampire how to play a simple human card game. Tomas the hunter sat at the same table as one of Lucian's captains, arguing about horses. Someone had produced a violin. The thin, trembling notes wove between the groups like a fragile bridge. "You see," Elena said softly beside Lucian, "they don't want to hate each other. They just don't know how not to." He glanced at her. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," she admitted, "but sometimes the first step is just sharing the same fire." His gaze returned to the hall. When I first took the throne, a human village sent a child to beg for mercy for his people. They had attacked one of our patrols. My advisors demanded blood in answer. The boy stood in front of my throne and shook so hard he could barely speak, but he would not leave until I promised I would listen. "What did you do?" Alina asked. "I let the village live," Lucian said. I still remember the way the boy looked at me, like I had turned from a nightmare into a man for just a breath. She studied his profile in the flickering light. "Maybe that's who you really are." "Or maybe I am both," he said quietly. "Nightmare and man, the storm does not stop being a storm because it spares one tree." "But it matters to the tree," she replied. They stood in thoughtful silence. Down below, someone began a rough but cheerful song. For a brief slice of time, the castle felt less like a fortress and more like a village caught in the same long winter. The feeling did not last. By the 5th day, the supplies ledger began to look thin. The storm still roared, relentless. Scouts sent out at dawn returned by noon half-frozen and shaken, bringing stories of buried cottages and families trapped in their homes, snow reaching the second-story windows. Even Lucian's strength began to stretch. Vampires were hard to starve, but hunger made them sharp and impatient. His people were used to moving in shadows, to taking what they needed carefully from the edges of human life. Now there were no edges, only this one island of light in a white sea. At a council meeting, voices rose. "We take in their hunters, their prince, feed them from our stores," one noble snapped, "while we deny our own nature. It is madness." "They are under my protection," Lucian replied. "And when our young lose control," another challenged, "who will you blame then, them or yourself?" Alina, sitting quietly near the fire, felt a tremor of real fear. Not for herself, but for the fragile peace she had seen blooming in shared games and songs. Adrian, pale but recovering, listened from a corner chair, jaw tight. Later, in the narrow corridor outside the council chamber, Adrian confronted Lucian. "You're losing them," he said bluntly. "Your nobles, your guards, they're hungry and scared. That's when people do foolish things." Lucian's eyes flashed. "I am aware." "Then let me help," Adrian said. "I know what fear looks like in human eyes. You know it in your people. Between us, maybe we can keep them from tearing each other apart before the storm even decides to let us live." The suggestion surprised them both. Adrian seemed almost startled by his own words. Alina, who had been about to speak, closed her mouth, watching the two men carefully. "You trust me now?" Lucian asked. "No," Adrian said, "but my pride won't warm anyone's hands. You saved my life. I can at least try to use it well." Something shifted between them then. Not friendship, not yet, but the faintest outline of respect drawn in thin, uncertain lines. Days blurred. Together, the three of them worked out new rules, new routines. Alina organized human volunteers to help in the kitchens and infirmary. Adrian spoke to the hunters and servants, convincing them to follow castle orders for their own safety. Lucian walked the halls each night, a silent shadow whose very presence kept hungry eyes from straying where they should not. Small kindnesses bloomed in the cracks of hardship. A vampire seamstress mended a hunter's torn coat. A human child left half a sweet bun on a plate. For the night people, because she had heard they did not eat normal food and wanted them to have something anyway. Someone tied ribbons around the bell ropes, so they chimed softer in the wind and did not wake the babies. The storm outside did not care. It roared and howled, a white beast with endless breath. On the 7th night, the first real test came. The great hall was crowded, fires banked high, when a young vampire named Corin staggered in from his post on the outer wall. His eyes were too wide, his lips colorless. He had not fed in many days. The scent of human sweat and tired hearts slammed into him like a wave. A tray slipped from a servant's hands, a mug shattered on stone. Heads turned. "Corin," Lucian said from the high end of the room, voice calm but carrying. "Stand down. Go to the cold wing. I will have a goblet brought to you from the stores." Corin's gaze slid to the nearest human, Tomas's boy, hands finally unwrapped, fingers pink and healing. The youth smiled at him, uncertain, trying to show he meant no harm. Corin's fangs slid down, unbidden. Elena saw it before most others and rose to her feet. "Corin," she said, stepping away from the hearth. "Look at me. You remember my name, don't you?" He flinched, torn between training and need. "My queen," he choked out. "I don't want to." He took a stumbling step toward the boy anyway. Lucian moved, but Elena was closer. In 3 long strides, she put herself between Corin and the human, hands spread, heart thudding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Around them, the hall froze. Vampires tensed, humans grasped whatever could become a weapon. Adrian pushed himself to his feet, too far away to reach her in time. Corin's pupils were blown wide, his breath ragged, the tips of his fangs inches from Elena's bare throat. His hands shook as he fought himself. "If you hurt him," she said softly, "you will hate yourself when you are full again. Don't let this storm turn you into something you're not." For a suspended instant, no one breathed. Lucian's hand closed slowly into a fist at his side. Power gathered around him, cold and dangerous as the deepest snow. One more inch, one wrong twitch, and he would strike against his own subject, his own kind, because the woman he had once regretted marrying now stood on the blade edge between peace and blood. The hall waited to see what he would choose.